My name is Irene Grover, and I was 25 years old when the man I planned to marry called me selfish in front of everyone we loved. For 2 years, my life had been intertwined with Daniel Hughes, a man whose ambition and charm pulled me in from the very beginning. We met through mutual friends who insisted we were compatible, and for once, they were right. Our first date stretched into hours of easy conversation, laughter spilling across the table as if we had known each other far longer than a single evening. Within weeks, we were inseparable. Within a year, we were living together. It felt natural, inevitable even, as though we were building something solid and lasting without needing to force it. I worked as a software engineer, a job that came with stability and a comfortable income. Daniel had been working in sales until he made the decision to leave his job and prepare for business school. His parents supported his ambitions wholeheartedly and agreed to cover his tuition. When he stepped away from his paycheck, the financial responsibility of our shared life shifted almost entirely onto me. Rent, utilities, insurance, daily expenses, I covered them all. Daniel contributed where he could, gas and groceries mostly, but even that was becoming uncertain. I didn't resent it. I told myself this was what partnership looked like, one person stepping up so the other could grow. I believed that once he graduated and re-entered the workforce, balance would return. More than that, I believed in him. I believed in us. That belief was why, after months of planning, I proposed. I had saved carefully for the ring, imagining the moment over and over again. When I finally asked him to marry me, Daniel said yes without hesitation. For a few days, we floated in that newly engaged haze, talking about the future like it was already ours. We planned an engagement party to celebrate with our families and friends, a simple gathering at our home full of warmth and shared joy. The night of the party, I thought I was the happiest woman in the room. Our living room buzzed with laughter and congratulations. My parents hugged me with pride, his parents beamed, and for a moment, everything felt exactly right. Then Daniel approached me, his expression tense, and said we needed to talk. Now. I followed him to our bedroom, expecting privacy. Instead, I walked into a room filled with his friends, 6 of them, all watching me. Daniel had maintained close friendships since high school, including with his ex-girlfriend and their shared social circle, people who came from money in ways I never had. I had always noticed the difference in lifestyles, the casual luxury they lived with, but I believed Daniel was above that. Standing there, surrounded by them, I wasn't so sure anymore. He explained they'd been discussing plans for his Bachelor trip. I smiled, relieved, and told him I had no issue with that. Of course he should celebrate. I trusted him. Then he said the words that changed everything. He wanted me to pay for it. All of it. For everyone. A week-long luxury trip. Exotic beaches, expensive hotels, no compromises. The room went silent. Daniel explained that since he wasn't working, he couldn't afford it. He couldn't ask his parents. They were already paying for business school. But it was fine, he said, because I could cover it. He promised he'd pay me back one day. Every eye stayed on me. My chest tightened as I did the math I already knew I didn't need to do. The cost would tear straight through my savings, the money I had set aside for our future. A future that suddenly felt frighteningly one-sided. I told him calmly that I supported the idea of a bachelor trip, but not funding one for his entire group. I suggested scaling it down or finding another way to pay. The disappointment in the room was immediate, palpable. Daniel didn't back down. He followed me into the living room, pressing the issue as guests began to notice. When I suggested we discuss it later, he snapped. He called me selfish, stingy, accused me of betraying his dreams. The words landed like blows. I reminded him, too sharply, that I had been supporting both of us for over a year, that I had sacrificed without complaint. And in a moment of hurt I wish I could take back, I said that if he truly believed I was selfish, maybe we shouldn't be together at all. Daniel burst into tears and ran out. The party dissolved in awkward apologies and silent goodbyes. That night, I lay awake, waiting for him to call. He never did. The house felt hollow after everyone left, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Empty cups lined the counter. Half-deflated balloons sagged near the ceiling. Everywhere I looked, there were traces of a celebration that had collapsed in on itself. I stood alone in the living room for a long time, replaying Daniel's words over and over, wondering how something so small, one question about money, had detonated everything we had built. I didn't sleep that night. I kept my phone beside me, the screen lighting up every time a notification came in, only to disappoint me again and again. No text, no call, nothing. By morning, the silence felt deliberate, like punishment. The next day, it still wasn't Daniel who reached out. It was his parents. They called mid-morning, their voices heavy with concern, asking if we could talk. They explained that Daniel had checked into a hotel nearby. He was emotional, embarrassed, and refusing to come home. They didn't excuse what he'd done, not outright, but their words carried an unmistakable undercurrent. He didn't mean it. He was under pressure. This didn't have to end like this. They told me something I hadn't fully understood before. Daniel had always struggled around his friends, especially those who had more than he did. His ex-girlfriend had come from a family with serious money, and many of their friends shared that background. Even after that relationship ended, the comparison never really stopped. He constantly felt like he had to prove something: success, status, worth. Hearing that made my chest ache. I wanted to believe this was a moment of weakness, not a glimpse into our future. But then his parents said something that made me pause. They mentioned that since Daniel wasn't working, they were counting on me to support him financially while he finished school. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but clear. If we broke up, things would become complicated, for him and for them. After the call ended, I sat there, staring at nothing, realizing how tangled everything had become. Love, money, responsibility. It was all blurred together in a way I hadn't noticed before. Days passed without a word from Daniel. I went through my routines mechanically. Work, home, sleep, or something like it. Every quiet moment filled itself with questions. Had I been too harsh? Should I have chased after him that night? Or was I finally seeing the imbalance I'd been ignoring for too long? I loved him. That hadn't changed. But love wasn't supposed to feel like standing alone in a crowded room, defending your boundaries while everyone else watched. By the end of the week, his parents had started texting me regularly, gently urging me to reach out, to fix things, to be the bigger person. Each message made the weight on my chest heavier. I realized that if we were going to move forward, together or apart, I needed clarity. So I sent him a message. We need to talk. My hands shook as I hit send. I told myself I wasn't doing this to beg him back. I needed answers. I needed to know whether the man I planned to marry saw me as a partner or as a solution to his problems. When his reply finally came, hours later, it was brief but sobering. He admitted he didn't like the version of himself that had surfaced that night. He didn't want to talk over the phone. He suggested we meet in person, for lunch, near my office, so I wouldn't miss much work. The thoughtfulness in that detail only confused me more. As the meeting approached, I felt a tight knot of dread and hope twisting together inside me. This conversation could lead anywhere: reconciliation, apology, or an ending I wasn't ready to face. All I knew was that whatever happened next would change everything. The morning of our lunch meeting arrived faster than I expected, and somehow still felt impossibly far away. I woke up with that familiar tightness in my chest, the kind that made every breath feel shallow. The week leading up to it had stretched on endlessly, each day blurring into the next, filled with unanswered questions and a gnawing sense that something fundamental had shifted between Daniel and me. I kept replaying the engagement party in my mind, dissecting every word, every expression. I wondered if there had been a moment where I could have handled things differently, if a softer tone or a quieter refusal would have changed the outcome. But every time I reached that thought, another followed close behind. Why had I been the only one expected to bend? At work, I caught myself staring at my screen, lines of code swimming in front of my eyes. Colleagues asked if I was okay, and I smiled automatically, offering vague reassurances. It was easier than explaining that my future felt like it was hanging by a thread, dependent on a conversation that hadn't happened yet. Daniel's parents stopped texting altogether 2 days before our meeting. The sudden silence felt ominous, as though they had stepped back to let whatever was coming run its course. That alone told me they were bracing themselves for the possibility that this might truly be the end. I tried to imagine what Daniel would say when we met. Would he apologize? Would he double down? Would he expect me to fold, to reassure him that everything would be fine as long as we stayed together? The thought made my stomach twist. I realized that somewhere along the way, I had started preparing myself not just to hear his truth, but to speak my own. The night before the meeting, I barely slept. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how sure I had been when I slipped that ring onto his finger. How confident I'd felt that love, patience, and effort were enough to get us through anything. Now, that certainty felt naive. When morning came, I dressed carefully, choosing something simple and professional, as if armor could be woven from fabric. I told myself not to expect anything, not reconciliation, not closure, just honesty. As I drove to work, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Whatever happened at lunch, I knew one thing with painful clarity. I couldn't continue being the person who absorbed every blow just to keep the peace. I loved Daniel deeply, but love shouldn't require erasing yourself. By the time I reached my office, my phone buzzed with a message from him. I'm on my way. Short. Neutral. No heart emojis, no apologies. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then slipped the phone into my bag. In a few hours, I would finally hear what he had to say, and whether I was ready or not, I would have to decide what I was willing to accept and what I wasn't. When I saw Daniel walking toward the restaurant across the street from my office, my first thought was how familiar he looked, and how distant at the same time. He moved more slowly than I remembered, shoulders slightly hunched, as if the weight of the past week had settled physically onto him. For a brief, disorienting second, I had the urge to stand up and hug him, to pretend none of this had happened. That instinct faded the moment our eyes met. We greeted each other politely, almost formally, like strangers who shared a complicated history. No kiss, no touch, just a quiet hi that carried far more meaning than the word itself ever should have. We sat down, ordered food we barely touched, and stared at the table between us as if it might offer guidance. Finally, Daniel spoke. He told me he hadn't slept much either. He said he'd spent the week replaying the engagement party in his head, seeing himself through my eyes for the first time, and not liking what he saw. Hearing that sent a small flicker of relief through me, but it was cautious, restrained. I had learned too quickly how fragile hope could be. He admitted that asking me to pay for the Bachelor trip had been wrong, that ambushing me in front of his friends was worse. He said he'd felt humiliated when I refused, not because I was wrong, but because it forced him to confront something he'd been avoiding for years, his insecurity. He talked about growing up around people who always seemed ahead, always richer, always more impressive. About how his ex-girlfriend and their shared social circle had set a standard he'd never stopped measuring himself against, even long after that relationship ended. As he spoke, I noticed how carefully he chose his words, how much effort it took for him to admit these things. Part of me softened. Another part stayed rigid, guarding itself. Because understanding the reason behind someone's behavior didn't erase the damage it caused. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and placed something small and familiar on the table between us. The ring. The sight of it knocked the air out of my lungs. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My fingers curled tightly in my lap as he explained, quietly, that he couldn't move forward with our engagement. Not yet. He said he needed to stand on his own feet, financially and emotionally, before marrying anyone. that he didn't want to rely on me or his parents anymore, that staying together right now would only repeat the same imbalance in different forms. I asked him if this was goodbye. He nodded. There was no anger in his voice, no drama, just resignation. He thanked me for supporting him, for believing in him, for loving him when he wasn't sure he deserved it. I didn't know how to respond. Gratitude felt like such a strange note to end a relationship on, yet it was sincere. We talked for a long time after that, about small things and big ones, about who we had been when we met and who we had become. He told me he would come by in a few days to pick up the rest of his things. I didn't ask where he was going to live. It didn't matter anymore. When we stood to leave, he hesitated, then opened his arms. I stepped into the hug, resting my cheek against his shoulder, breathing him in one last time. It wasn't dramatic. It was gentle, final. I didn't cry until after he walked away. Back at the office, I locked myself in the restroom and let the tears come, silent and heavy. I cried for the future we wouldn't have, for the mornings I wouldn't wake up next to him, for the version of us that almost made it. And when I finally looked at myself in the mirror, eyes red but steady, I knew something else too. Loving him had cost me more than money. Walking away was the first thing I had done purely for myself. The days after our lunch meeting passed in a strange blur, quiet but heavy, like the world had been wrapped in cotton. Daniel came by exactly when he said he would. He packed his things carefully, methodically, as if treating our shared life like a checklist might keep the emotions at bay. We spoke politely, almost kindly. There were no arguments left to have. Everything important had already been said. When the door closed behind him for the last time, the silence didn't rush in the way I expected. Instead, it settled slowly, deliberately, filling every corner of the apartment. I wandered from room to room, noticing the spaces he used to occupy. The empty side of the closet, the cleared nightstand, the faint outline where his favorite mug had always sat. It hurt, but not in the sharp, explosive way I'd feared. It was a dull, aching grief, the kind that comes from accepting something you can't change. A few days later, something unexpected happened. Daniel texted me, not to reopen old wounds, not to ask for anything, but to tell me something I hadn't anticipated. After the engagement party, his friends had confronted him. The same people I had quietly blamed for pushing him toward that disastrous demand had, in fact, told him he was wrong. They told him he'd crossed a line, that he couldn't expect me to bankroll his insecurities, and that if he wanted to build a future, he needed to stop pretending he was someone he wasn't. They even admitted they would never have judged him, or me, if he'd been honest about what he could and couldn't afford. Reading that message forced me to confront my own assumptions. I had painted them as shallow and entitled because it made the situation easier to understand. But the truth, as it often is, was more complicated. The pressure Daniel felt hadn't come from them alone. It had come from within himself. His parents reached out once more, this time not to ask me to fix anything. They thanked me for loving him, for supporting him, for letting him go when holding on would have been easier. That conversation, gentle and restrained, felt like the final thread being carefully cut. I returned the ring to its box and placed it in the back of my drawer. Not because I wanted to forget it ever existed, but because I wanted to remember it for what it truly was. A promise made with good intentions, even if it couldn't be kept. Stop. Part 6. The ending I didn't plan for. It's strange how life keeps moving, even when yours feels paused. Weeks turned into months. My routines slowly reshaped themselves around the absence Daniel left behind. I spent more time with friends I'd neglected. I stayed late at work by choice instead of obligation. I learned what it felt like to come home and answer only to myself. There were nights I still reached for my phone, instinctively wanting to tell him something small and unimportant. There were mornings I woke up missing the sound of his voice. Grief doesn't disappear all at once. It thins out, fades gradually, until one day you realize you're breathing easier than before. I thought often about what we had almost become. about how close love can come to turning into sacrifice without you noticing, about how easy it is to confuse commitment with endurance. I didn't regret loving Daniel. I didn't even regret supporting him. But I did regret the moments when I ignored my own discomfort just to keep the peace. We ended things on good terms, and in its own quiet way, that mattered. There was no villain in our story, just two people who reached a crossroads and realized they needed different things to keep moving forward. Sometimes I wonder if we'll find our way back to each other someday, when we're both stronger, more certain of who we are. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. What I do know is that if that day ever comes, it won't be built on obligation or unspoken expectations. It will be built on choice. And for the first time in a long while, I'm choosing myself.